Hi everyone, and welcome to this presentation on stress and injury. So how to prevent injury and subsequent re-injury. I'm just going to get rid of me here actually. So my name is Garth Fox and I'm a performance psychologist. So I work with athletes, business people on how to improve their performance, but also at the same time work with general public on how to improve their performance in day-to-day life. So that's performance in areas like their social lives or their relationships, work lives, health and fitness, emotional life. And as we'll see today in this presentation, these are actually key areas when it comes to injury prevention. So the aim of the presentation is to give you a better and wider understanding of what causes injury. So injury isn't just a physical thing. It's not just a physical movement that causes an injury. We have to look at it as a psychophysiological thing, which is mind and body, which means that the physiological side, the actual physical injury or the openness to physical injury is set up by the psychological side, how we think and how we approach certain situations, not only in our sporting domain, but in day-to-day lives. Now, there's a lot more depth to the topic than what I'm going to actually discuss here today, but these things will provide you, or hopefully will provide you with a better understanding of where your potential injuries are coming from. So certain things that we're going to look at are the causes of injury, the stress model, stress response, impact of stress on the body, and then certain psychological interventions that can help you avoid the potential of injury. So when we think about the causes of injury, they're often attributed to bad luck or wrong place at the wrong time scenarios. But more often than not, there are specific identifiable factors that cause injury. So these factors might be environmental, which is people failing to pay attention to key factors in their environment, someone stepping out in front of a car. Biomechanical, so that's technical deficiencies in form or technique. Anatomical, so that could be someone who overpronates or underpronates when running. And then psychological, and this is what we're going to be focusing on today in the presentation. So here we have the stress model, and although I'm going to explain it through the lens of sport, it also applies to every other areas of your lives, which is extremely important. It's not just stress in sport that causes injury in sport. Work stress, relationship stress, financial stress, important areas of your life can cause stress, and that stress can lead to injury in your sporting domain. So if we look at the stress model, we have a potentially stressful situation, and it's important to note that it's only a potentially stressful situation. It's potentially stressful because of how the athlete appraises or interprets the meaning of the situation that they enter into, which is a choice. So as individuals, when we enter into a situation, one of the things that we do is we make an assessment of the demands of that situation. So let's call that situation a competition. We ask ourselves, what's being required of me in this particular competition? So that could be the opposition that I'm coming up against, or potentially the severity of the competition, what level we're at. Is this a final? Is this just a challenge game? Is it something that's important? And at the same time as asking ourselves, what are the demands? We also ask ourselves, what are my abilities or my resources or my capabilities for meeting the demands of the situation? So we weigh both up. We weigh our resources against our demands. Now, our resources in an athletic domain could be how well we've slept, how well we've been eating, how well we've prepared for that game or that competition, how well we've been training. We look at how well we're prepared physically. And if we believe we have the capabilities to meet the demands, then we're likely to interpret the situation as a challenge and one that we can successfully meet and do well. So non-stressful. However, if we believe the demands are greater than our resources or our ability to meet those demands, we are likely to see the situation as threatening, so stressful. Now, I want to just give an important side note here. When we're talking about resources versus demands for an athlete, we tend to think about those things in the athletic domain, so physical conditioning or technical abilities. But the bigger picture, and I think the most important thing about this presentation, is that a lot of our stress is caused outside of sport. So depending on our life area, we are constantly and continuously weighing our resources against our demands. And I suppose the word that we can use for that is cope. Can I cope? So what does that look like? That looks like, let's say you enter into a new relationship, or you get engaged, or you get married, or you're having kids, you're moving house, you're buying a new house, perhaps you're building a new house, you are currently in the process of getting divorced, or you're separating from your relationship, you're changing job, or you've got new responsibilities in your job, maybe even financial situations. All these situations and a lot of other ones that I haven't mentioned cause us to ask ourselves, am I going to be able to cope? Am I going to be able to deal with this situation? So the same thing is happening, whether it be consciously or subconsciously. We're weighing our resources against the demands of the situation. And if the demands are too big, or we perceive them as being too big, then that's when we see that situation as a threat. And that's when we switch on the stress response. So again, if we look at a competitive situation and we believe that we have the resources in order to be able to deal with the demands, we won't see it as threatening. We won't go into a stress response. We'll potentially go into what we call flow state. We see it as a challenge, but we feel like we're up for that challenge. Now, the stress response comes in when we see that the demands are greater than our resources. So let's look at the stress response. So the stress response is characterized by two key features: an attentional component and a physical component. With the attentional component, multiple things happen to an athlete under stressful conditions. So under that, the demands are too big or greater than the resources that I have. So first of all, we have much less ability to see things in our peripheral environment. So this is what we call tunnel vision. For instance, the athlete who is really stressed might only be able to see directly in front of them and fail to see the opponent who is coming from the side. So under these conditions, we are more susceptible to getting hurt. I have a perfect example for that with myself. To this day, I can't remember how I broke my wrist in a game because I didn't see the opponent coming and we went into a collision. I didn't see it, and whatever way I fell and broke my wrist. But what predated that actual movement or that moment within a game was that I had made a really bad start, and I was also able to look across at the substitutes bench and see that the player who would maybe normally come on and replace me was getting warmed up. So I knew that I was going to be substituted. Therefore, I was under huge amounts of stress and had complete tunnel vision and didn't see the opponent coming in to make a challenge, which was probably a normal challenge made in that scenario. And if I hadn't been under that stress, because I was worried about my own performance, then I would have been able to perhaps prepare myself for that challenge, or even move away or out of the, I suppose, what's the best way to put it, out of reach of that player coming in to tackle me. But I didn't see them because I was suffering from that tunnel vision. Now, something else that also happens when we're talking about attentional changes is that when we're stressed, we're more susceptible to become involved in thoughts outside of the task at hand. So the task at hand is that game that we're playing and the things that we need to do, the role that we have within that competition. And the thoughts that start to creep in outside of the task at hand are things like, in a sporting domain, is my coach going to take me off? Once you start thinking about that, then you're unable or unaware of what's happening around your peripheral vision. Other things, if your stressor is coming from outside of your sporting domain, let's say you might just have separated from a relationship and you're in the middle of your sport, you're in the middle of competing, and suddenly you start to be overwhelmed by those thoughts. Again, you have limits to your peripheral vision, and that's going to make you more susceptible to getting hurt. The second change that we have when we're under the stress response is a physiological change. So that's the impact of stress on the body, and we look at that now in more detail. So firstly, I want to give you a little analogy comparing your heart to a car engine. So think of your heart like a car engine. So they both have valves, they both have pressurized chambers. And like a car engine, which is responsible for making the rest of the car parts run, your heart is responsible for making organs run, muscle function, by sending blood, oxygen, nutrients around the body. So the scenario that I would like you to imagine is that you're in a car at a T-junction and you're pulling out onto the road, and you've misjudged the speed of the car coming from your left. So when you pull out onto that road and you've misjudged that speed, what you have to now do is you have to put your foot fully down on the accelerator in order to get your speed up as quick as possible, which in turn speeds everything else up within the car. So if we're also avoiding something that's threatening, and again, I use the word threat because, as I talked about earlier, it's perceived threat that causes the stress response. So when you're avoiding something threatening, let's say it could be a boss at work, could be a teammate, it could be management, your heart responds in the same way as that car engine. It responds to acute stress by kicking into overdrive. So your heart rate increases, blood vessels contract and tighten, which allow for quicker blood flow through the body to get blood, oxygen, nutrients to vital parts of the body faster in order for you to be able to deal with that threat. Now, this in certain areas is a really beneficial thing. It's really beneficial when we're responding to an emergency. But the majority of the time, the threat that we're responding to isn't that life or death emergency. So I want you to imagine that that car has come out of the T-junction with the accelerator pushed the full way down, perhaps in second gear. So now you're driving at max RPMs. You drive the whole way home like that. And then the following day, you continue to drive like that. And the following day, the following day, the following day. Eventually, important parts of the car are going to break down. To drive in that way is just not sustainable. And so if we go back to the heart, we go back to the human element, remaining under constant stress or chronic stress, whether that stress exists within your sporting domain or in daily life events, having our heart constantly in overdrive causes damage and weakening everywhere else. So that shows up as things like weakening around the support systems, our ankles, our knees, things like that. I remember one person who I spoke with who had an ankle injury, and I asked him the question, what was stressful in your life around the time of that injury? And the response was that there was an awful lot of media attention on them at that time because they'd had a couple of good seasons, and there was talk of them perhaps going to a different country and playing a different sport. So it was all over the media and everyone was wondering, where are they going to do it? So therefore, that's an outside stressor. That's stressing mentally, where that person is maybe asking themselves, do I have the demands to be able to, do I have the resources, sorry, to be able to cope with the demands of this situation? And the more that they saw it as a demanding situation, the more the stress response was turned on, and over a prolonged period of time, eventually the support system breaks down, and that person ended up with an ankle injury. We see it all the time also with ACL injuries. The majority of LCL, if not all ACL injuries, happen through movements that the athlete has done on multiple occasions. So then why that one-off occasion does it then cause that ACL injury? Well, that's because they've been under perceived stress or perceived threat for a prolonged period of time, just like the car engine being on and driving around like that for too long with the foot fully down on the accelerator at a very low gear, and parts of the car are going to break down. The body does the same. So someone who feels like they're under a huge amount of pressure, well, the first thing to go under pressure are the support systems. Support systems are our ankles, our knees, things like that. So it's not specifically physically that the body was weak. It started a long time before mentally that weakened the body. So we were in a stress response for much too long. Now, the one that we're going to look at in most detail is actually how the stress response shows up in muscle injuries. Again, this happens to lots of different parts of the body, but we're actually going to look specifically at muscle injuries. So when we're experiencing a stress response, the body produces a number of hormones. So that's things like adrenaline, norepinephrine, cortisol. Those would be the three main stress hormones. And these hormones are, firstly, they're extremely helpful and beneficial for that emergency scenario, for that short-term emergency scenario where we need to act in a certain way in order to be able to avoid threat. In small doses, they won't really do too much damage to the system. But as we've discussed, the majority of our stress response are created by daily hassles and negative life events. And these aren't short-lived bursts. It's just not one thought and then it's done with. We think about them on a daily basis. We think about our ability to cope from our separation on a daily basis. So we're constantly switching on the stress response. We think about our ability to pay off bills. We think about our ability to create the house that we want for our family, or am I good enough for this relationship? Whatever that might be, all those thoughts where we're perceiving that we mightn't actually be able to cope, we mightn't have the ability to deal with the demands, they're all switching on the stress response. And the longer that stress response stays on, then the more it breaks down the body. So now we have a body that has an excess of cortisol over a prolonged period of time, which leads to an increase or a prolonged catabolic effect. So catabolic simply means the breakdown of something. And in this case, it's of muscle protein, so your muscles. And if we have an increase in the catabolic effect, which is the breakdown of muscle, then naturally we have a decrease in the anabolic effect, which is muscle repair. So this means that you aren't going to build the muscle back up if you're someone who's already had a muscle injury, or make new muscle, which is really going to stunt your injury recovery. So the big question here is, how do we counter this? How do we reduce the chances, first of all, of injury, and secondly, of re-injury? And how can we improve our injury recovery? Well, what we have to do is isolate the source of our stress and reduce it. So for me, here's the thing. There are a number of prescribed intervention strategies in the scientific literature, which are beneficial. We have relaxation techniques like breathing exercises, imagery like visualization, self-talk. So that could be thinking about a situation in a more beneficial way, practicing mindfulness, which is being present. If you're present, then you're not thinking about potential difficulties down the line, or you're not also thinking about the worst case scenarios that you've previously experienced. So you're not causing stress and you're not creating that stress response. All these things do show good signs of reducing stress. And if you aren't already practicing them, then I suggest that you do. But as we've talked about and seen earlier, we know that stress is caused by our appraisal of our resources against the demands at stake. So for me, the big takeaway from this is, depending on your stressor or the area of your life causing you most stress, you have to actually go out and improve your resources in that area. You're always going to weigh up resources against demands. You can't really lower a demand. The mind won't allow you to lower a demand. If you're coming up and playing against an opponent who's really good, you saying to yourself, oh, they're not that good, your mind's just going to go, yeah, whatever. So you can't lower a demand. But in order to be able to then, let's say, lessen the stress response or lower the stress response, you can increase your resources. So whether that be in the sporting domain, you can get better, you can train better, train smarter, log all the training so that you're looking at your resources and saying to yourself, yeah, look, everything's been working really well. There are an awful lot more things that you can actually do in order to increase your sporting resources, but also your resources in day-to-day life. Those are the things that we have to look at. Those are the things in the background that are causing injury, that are weakening the body. And those are the things that we need to improve on. So hopefully you've been able to see another side of where injury comes from, some of the main causes of injury. And if anyone has any questions on this afterwards, don't hesitate to get in contact. And thank you very much for listening.